Welcome to the Carnegie Council. Today, our speaker is Robert Dallek, and he will be discussing his latest work, The Lost Peace, Leadership in a Time of Horror and Hope, 1945 to 1953. I'm Joanne Myers, Director of Public Affairs, and on behalf of the Carnegie Council, I want to thank you all for joining us. Leadership and decision-making is a subject we have visited before, but today we have the special opportunity to listen to one of our country's most distinguished historians, Robert Dallek, as he deconstructs decisions taken by world leaders in the period from the closing months of World War II through the early years of the Cold War. The decisions taken during that time had and still have profound consequences, influencing our relations with China, Korea, the Middle East, and around the globe. Heads of states have always had the power to influence events. This was especially clear at the end of World War II, when the time seemed ripe for a calculated revolution in world politics. The Allies' defeat of fascism, Nazism, and Japanese militarism presented an extraordinary opportunity for a more rational approach to international differences and more humane governance. The leaders at that time, Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin, Mao, Gaulle, and Truman, were an able and an effective group of politicians who found themselves with circumstances favorable to changing international relations for the better. Yet these leaders failed to attain the elusive goal of world peace. What went wrong? Why did they rely on traditional power politics despite the catastrophic violence their nations had endured? As this insightful book indicates, history is a sum of hundreds of individual decisions. Accordingly, Mr. Dallek examines the irreversible mistakes by weighing the choices these leaders made against alternative scenarios that might have led to a more peaceful and more constructive outcome. While he advocates that today's leaders heed the mistakes of the past, he writes that he remains optimistic in that the missteps recounted should be taken not as an admission of hopelessness, but as a reminder that flawed leadership was less the consequence of circumstances than of choice. As our country tries to define its foreign policy strategy and maps out its goals, a reading of The Lost Peace offers not only a fascinating historical perspective, but provides timely insight. In the end, this book reveals that we do have the capacity to learn from history. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to our guest today, the distinguished historian, Robert Dallek. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that very nice introduction. And when I get an introduction like that, it always puts me in mind of one I got several years back when I was lecturing in the Soviet Union. My host on that occasion, who I like to think had an imperfect command of English, introduced me by saying, Professor Dallek is the author of several distinguished works. They're the kinds of books that once you put them down, you can't pick them up again. Not music to the author's ears. I like to begin these talks also as a historian by relating another anecdote about my son, who's also become a historian and has a doctorate from my alma mater, Columbia. And when he was about 4 or 5 years old, he said to me one day, "Daddy," he said, "you're a doctor, aren't you?" And I said, "Well, yes, but not like your doctor, not like your pediatrician." He said, "Oh, I know that because you're also an historian." Well, I was delighted he could make this distinction at so tender an age, but then he wanted to know, does that mean that you make people in the past feel better? So let's see what I can do for these people in 1945 to 53. I'm not too optimistic. Let me begin by saying a word about what I've done in my scholarship over time. You know, every book I've written, and there are several, begins with a question, a central proposition that I want to address. When I began working on Franklin Roosevelt and American foreign policy, I was puzzled at the assertions about Roosevelt during World War II, that he was naive about Stalin, about the Chinese, about the Chinese communists, and didn't have a realistic grasp of world affairs. And I found this very difficult to accept, since he was the consummate politician and probably the greatest politician we had in the 20th century. I got into the archives, and what I found there confirmed my assumption that it was exaggerated to see him as naive. When I turned to John F. Kennedy for a biography, I was puzzled by the fact that he was a man who had served only 1,000 days. And when you ask people in this country, who are the greatest presidents in American history, consistently and predictably they told you Washington, Lincoln, FDR. But then they would add the name of John Kennedy. And I was puzzled. How could someone who had served, he was one of the briefest serving presidents in the country's history, had been there for only 1,000 days, why did they include him as one of the truly great presidents of American history? Well, again, I worked my way through the archives, and I found some very interesting answers there. Lyndon Johnson, 2 volumes that I did on LBJ. I again was puzzled. How could it be that a man who was in Roosevelt's tradition, so to speak, he loved FDR. He thought of himself as FDR's protege. And he, again, brilliant politician. How could he have been trapped out by Vietnam, which destroyed his presidency? 1964, he won that massive election, one of the great landslide victories in American presidential history. And yet by 1968, he had to resign because he had lost his hold on American public opinion. His consensus had been shattered. Again, I worked my way through the archives, and I found interesting answers. Nixon and Kissinger, a book I published 3 years ago, had a reputation as extraordinary foreign policy leaders. I went to the archives and I said, I'm thinking of doing a book on Nixon and Kissinger, but you know, I understand there are telephone transcripts that Mr. Kissinger has locked up in the Library of Congress till 5 years after his death. And the archivist said, do the book. He's being forced to open this material because the Foreign Relations series, you know, the famous series of Fru's Foreign Relations in the United States, is turning to the Nixon period now, and we've insisted that we have Mr. Kissinger's telephone transcripts. Well, 20,000 pages of materials, and absolutely fascinating stuff. Not all of it, obviously, plenty of grist there, but fascinating stuff nevertheless. Anyway, I'm not going to tell you what my findings were in each of these books. I'm going to make you buy them to, if this has been enough of a tease. But this is what I do. I begin with a question, and I go into archives. Now, this book, The Lost Peace, was a little different. Different in the sense that I wasn't going to go around the world because I was looking at leadership all over the globe. I was looking not only at Roosevelt and Truman and MacArthur and Joseph McCarthy in the United States, but I was looking at Nehru and Gandhi and Churchill and and Attlee and Stalin and Hitler and Syngman Rhee, Kim Il-sung, Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, and obviously I don't have the language skills to go and do that. But there was a puzzle here for me. At the end of World War II, there was such a yearning around the globe for long-term peace. The world had suffered so terribly. It was the greatest, most destructive war in human history. Probably 50 million people perished in that conflict. 25 million people alone in the Soviet Union. And in the Soviet Union, we know from materials that are available to historians now that there was such a yearning for a kind of accommodation with the West, hopeful that Stalin would be forgiving, so to speak, and allow the citizenry of the Soviet republics to have open and free exchange with people in the West. The hope that there could be some kind of long-term peace. And of course, it didn't come to pass. And the question I puzzled over was, why not? How did it come about? Let me just briefly read you from the preface to this book I've written, which at least gives you some general idea of what I tried to do in this book. This is a book about the generation of leaders in the years of upheaval between the close of World War II and the early Cold War. It's not a comprehensive history about why and how the Cold War began. Rather, it is an attempt to underscore the misjudgments and unwise actions that caused so much continuing strife and suffering, and suggest alternatives that might have made for greater international harmony. While I highlight the failings of the notable men who dominated the scene during this time, I'm not intent on denying them their due, or in the case of the greatest villains of the day, revising their reputations for wrongdoing. My greatest interest is in revisiting the decision-making and events of the period as a cautionary tale, a reprise of what went wrong as a call for future improvements in world affairs, or an educator's lesson of what might have been done to avoid the difficulties that beset strong and weak nations around the globe. Such an exercise in finger-pointing and advice-giving is bound to provoke debate. The what-ifs of history are always risky propositions, more the product of speculation than persuasive evidence. I would be the first to grant that my suggested remedies for the missteps of the period reflect the historian's advantage over leaders who could not know how things would turn out. During his presidency, John F. Kennedy told the historian David Herbert Donald, quote, "No one has a right to grade a president, not even poor James Buchanan, who has not sat in his chair, examined the mail and information that came across his desk, and learn why he made decisions." Yet, end quote, yet I would say it's the historian's job not only to examine the record as fully as possible, but also to render judgments on how past office holders performed. Otherwise, we are no more than chroniclers telling a story without meaning. I hope my retrospective suggestions on how world leaders might have done better for the millions of people they governed are seen as a constructive exercise that encourages reflection on their limitations. The fact that men and women gained governing power, whether by democratic elections or extra-constitutional means, is no guarantee of wise leadership. The success of this book depends less on whether I stimulate a chorus of approving nods on the alternatives I see to some of their actions than renewed discussion of how the most powerful men of the 1940s and early 50s performed, and more importantly, what their mistakes tell us about crafting more considered actions in the future. That most of the book's focus is on leaders' shortcomings is not meant as a lament about the limits of government to act more wisely. The post-45 era had its share of sensible actions between nations. I hope my discussion of wrong turns then is seen not as a cry of despair, but as a reminder that we can do better in resolving conflict and promoting international cooperation. Now, in that regard, I'll tell you an anecdote. About 4 or 5 years ago, a French attorney sent me an email in which he said he had read my Kennedy book. He was keenly interested in Kennedy. Could I have lunch with him in Washington, which is where I live? And I said, yes, of course, I'd be most interested to do that. We had lunch, very nice, intelligent man. My French is lousy and his English was perfect. Toward the end of this lunch, I asked him if he had children. And he said, yes, they were in their 20s. And I asked him, how do your children think of themselves? And he said, well, of course, as French, but also, he said, as Europeans. And I said, could your children imagine now a war between France and Germany? He said, of course not. Absolutely not. And what it reminded me of was a book that recently was published by James Sheehan, the German historian at Stanford University, called Where Have All the Soldiers Gone? And the book is about how Europe has gone from Mars to Venus, and how the United States has gone from Venus to Mars. See? This transformation. Now, apropos of all this, before I talk a little bit about the contents of this book, I tell you another anecdote about how we historians can get ourselves into trouble when we try and do this speculation about interpretation of other answers. I was once giving a lecture to a group of physicians, and one of them did not like anything I said. And so in the question and answer period, he said to me, "You're wrong. You're wrong about this, wrong about that." I stopped him. I said, no, doctor, you don't understand. Historians are never wrong. That's why we don't carry malpractice insurance. And I quoted to him the great Dutch historian Peter Gaulle, who said that history is argument without end. And it is. And we can argue over these issues to this day. And I think the purpose of doing that, before I talk to you a little bit about the misjudgments I see leaders making, the purpose of doing it, I think, is very much to put current people in mind, and particularly the leadership around the world, that they can do better. They can avoid the kinds of conflicts and losses and suffering that are so common. And tell, very briefly, one tale out of school. I've had dinner twice with President Obama. He's keenly interested in history. And in June of 2009, he invited a group of 9 historians. And then again, in May of this year, 2010, he invited 10 historians. And there were about 14 in the first dinner, 15 in the second dinner around the table in the White House. And we had a wonderful discussion with him on both occasions. And he is someone who's keenly interested in history, open to suggestions, to discussion as to how history can be used to do better in the present and hopefully in the future. Did we give him the elixir, the Holy Grail? Obviously not. He's struggling. But I can tell you, he's a very intelligent man. And how could it be otherwise? Someone who invites historians to have dinner with him. Let me say something about the miscalculations that I found and discussed in this book. First of all, the start of World War II. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. They were convinced that the United States was such a pacifist, isolationist nation that once they struck at our fleet and decimated it at Pearl Harbor, we would not last for more than 6 months in the war. Admiral Yamamoto, who designed the attack on Pearl Harbor, said, if the Americans fight for more than 6 months, we'll lose the war. But it was his hope, and the hope of the Japanese leadership, that we would give up before then. Adolf Hitler declared war on the United States. We didn't declare war on him. He declared war on us 4 days after Pearl Harbor, December 11th, 1941. And Hitler's assumption, again, was that the United States was a bastard society made up of Jews and Catholics, Germans and French and Poles and Hungarians and Russians and blacks and Hispanics, and it couldn't possibly be the equal of the Übermenschen, of the master race in Germany. This terrible miscalculation on his part as well. We made a terrible error in judgment also at the start of the war. We thought the fleet in Pearl Harbor would be a great deterrent. The Japanese wouldn't attack because the fleet was there to deter them. In fact, the Japanese saw it as a target. Now, the great German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche said that convictions are greater enemies of the truth than lies. See? And this is what we're talking about. People enter into these convictions, these assumptions, these beliefs that so lead them astray. And they're not open to being educated, so to speak, or informed, or to thinking outside the box in different ways that might lead them toward a wiser judgment. Give you some examples. Take Stalin, first of all. Joseph Stalin was, of course, a brilliant dictator, if one can use the term brilliant, and couldn't accept the idea that at the end of World War II, there could be an accommodation with the United States. We were enormously grateful to the Soviets for, as George Kennan said, having torn the guts out of the Nazi war machine. We were highly sympathetic. And of course, the picture of the Soviet Union during the war that was painted by Wendell Willkie, remember in that book, One World, you see, that they're becoming just like us. Willkie's proposition was that we were going to get along for as far into the future as anyone could see. And the American public was just so smitten with this idea. In fact, Henry Luce, anything but a liberal, conservative Henry Luce, published in Look magazine an article in which he said, the Soviet people are just like the American people. They dress like us, they think like us, they talk like us. They have an NKVD that is just like our FBI. Now maybe that part was true, but as for the rest, it was this illusory thinking that we really are one world. We're all part of the same. Stalin was convinced that by his Marxist ideology, that there had to be this struggle between capitalism and communism, and that communism would triumph. If he had been more receptive to the idea that we wanted to get along, that we were going to accept the fact that they had a system different from ours, but that they were restrained. But instead, of course, he rushed to take over Eastern Europe. He rushed to build nuclear weapons. The great mistake, one of the great mistakes, I feel, of this post-war era has to do with the building of atomic and hydrogen bombs. And here I take much of my text from what George Kennan wrote later in his book called The Nuclear Delusion. Harry Truman went to the Potsdam Conference, and he meets with Stalin and Churchill initially, and then Clement Attlee. And at the end of one meeting, Truman, I'm sure many of you know this, went up to Stalin and casually said to him, "We have a new all-powerful weapon." And Stalin, cool as could be, said, "Very good, I hope you use it well." See? What a foolish thing on both sides. Why couldn't Truman have gone into conference with him just with translators and have said, we're developing an atomic bomb, see? Didn't mean he had to give the secret to Stalin. Didn't mean we had to open ourselves to giving them equal access to that weapon. Shouldn't Truman have understood that Stalin's reaction meant, of course he knew about the development of that weapon. They had spies in the Manhattan Project. He knew what was going on. After that conversation, Stalin went back, and we know this from archival materials now, to talk to some of his principal aides, and he said, we must speed up our development of the bomb. See? The hydrogen bomb, 1950. We, at that point, had something like 100 atomic bombs, and the Soviets maybe had 2 or 3, if that. Kennan wrote a 79-page memo in which he counseled Acheson and the Truman White House not to build a hydrogen bomb. He said, these are not usable weapons. The only thing you can do with them, you can't use them on the battlefield because you'll destroy your own troops as well as the enemy. The only thing you can do is massive destruction. Tell the Soviets we can develop a hydrogen bomb. We don't want to do it. We need to be restrained. Let's not get into an arms race. Now, would Stalin have said, oh, yes, let's kiss and be lovey-dovey? I doubt it. But you know, if we had done that, and the Soviets went ahead and developed the hydrogen bomb, we would have known about it very quickly. We had this huge advantage over them, 100-1 probably, in atomic bombs. There was no real danger to the United States. And we then instantly could have gone ahead to build hydrogen bombs. A similar point about NATO. George Kennan regretted greatly the fact that his memos about containing communism, which was a brilliant idea, because what he was talking about was political and economic containment. not military containment. He opposed the building up of NATO. And his argument was that if we set up this military alliance, which is unnecessary, because the Soviets are not going to move against Western Europe. This is not Adolf Hitler. He's not intent upon, he's too careful, too determined to sustain his own regime and survival. Kennan argued, don't do it, you see. They will set up a counter-alliance, which of course is exactly what they did, setting up the Warsaw Pact. He later wrote at length about how this arms race had developed. And Stalin, of course, makes this huge blunder, miscalculation, that he can outbid us in an arms race. And of course, the outcome is what? That he destroys Soviet communism in many ways. The investment in their military establishment was so phenomenal. I had visited the Soviet Union, 1979, again in 89. I was astonished when I got there at the impoverishment of that society, at the low level of, I rode on some buses and looking at the ordinary citizen, the clothing they were wearing. You know, I went into what was called the Produktia supermarket of theirs. All you found on the shelves were a few cans of fish and some rotten potatoes. And, you know, I stayed in the Rossiya in that hotel. And for breakfast, I mean, you know, some mornings there would be some eggs, and other mornings they had no supplies because it was wintertime and they could not clear the rivers to use the barges to bring products into Moscow. And I found it in many ways a kind of primitive society, but not their military. They had built up this phenomenal military establishment, but of course, in the long run, it ruined them, it seems to me. It brought them down. Reagan was right in the sense that, you know, keep up the arms race, it's going to break their back, you see. So, dead wrong. There are so many other examples of this. Charles de Gaulle. De Gaulle was an absolutely brilliant leader. In some ways, I think he may have been the greatest leader coming out of World War II, in the sense that he had nothing. And yet, he emerges, he has no army to speak of, he's in exile in London, he's beholden to the British and the Americans, and yet he maintains a certain dignity. And when he meets with Roosevelt and Stalin, and later Truman, and he writes in his diary, he's so perceptive. He meets Roosevelt at the Casablanca conference, and he says, the president did not view me kindly, see. And he said he wore a mask of amiability, and that was Roosevelt, of course, that he didn't think the French were worth a tinker's dam. They had surrendered. They didn't deserve a place at the peace table at the end of World War II, see. De Gaulle read him perfectly, you see. He goes to Moscow in 1944 and meets with Stalin at a drunken bacchanal, an evening dinner, and Stalin is drunk and he starts carrying on about how, you see this man, he does tank production, he does not meet quotas, we hang him. See this man, plane production, he does not meet quotas, we shoot him. And de Gaulle describes the look on his face, betrayed himself to Stalin, and Stalin said to him, I see you are not happy with what I describe. He said, well, you see, people think I'm a monster, but maybe I have sense of humor, you see. De Gaulle knew better, you see. He understood. He came to the United States in the fall of 1945, and he said, the Americans, they think the world will be perfect if everybody just follows their lead. The American proposition he found was that inside of every foreigner is an American waiting to emerge. That's what he sees. And so he really was quite extraordinary, except he has the conviction that France cannot be a great power again unless it reclaims its colonial empire. And he drives to put France back into Vietnam. And of course, the price they pay in blood and treasure is, of course, terrible, you see. What a miscalculation. Let me give you one more example. I don't want to overstay my welcome. The Korean War, Korea. Syngman Rhee, Kim Il-sung are dying to get into war with each other. In 1950, Syngman Rhee is 50 years old. I'm sorry, 70 years old. 70 years old. He's determined to unify the peninsula under his control. Kim Il-sung has the same objective. And he asked Stalin's permission to move against the South. Stalin at first demurs, tells him there's an insurgency in the South against Syngman Rhee. Hold your hand, maybe that insurgency will topple him. But it's not going to. And he convinces Stalin that he should let him attack the South. Stalin's assumption is that though Dean Acheson has said that Korea is not part of a Northeast Asian security belt, and this seems to be an inducement to let the North Koreans attack the South, Stalin's convinced that if there is a war, the Americans will come into the fighting. And he was absolutely right there. And he thought, this will be great, because it will distract them from my East European empire. They won't be able to put pressure on me over what's happening in Europe. Dead wrong. Because what comes out of the Korean War is NSC 68, National Security Council Directive 68, which leads to this massive expansion of the American military. And of course, forces Stalin, as he sees it, into a massive expansion of his military, and the ultimate outcome, as I said before, is the collapse of his Soviet system. And so, Kim Il-sung, Syngman Rhee, Stalin, their goals for this Korean War, they're dead wrong, you see. We come into the war, and I find that quite understandable. Truman could not sit back and just let them come across the parallel. First of all, politically, it would have been very destructive to him in 1950. But also, what he understood was that it would have shocked and undermined the confidence of our allies in Japan and in Europe. And so he needed to come into that war. MacArthur brilliantly executes the landing in Incheon. They drive the North Koreans back above the parallel. And then the big decision, what do? Do you cross the parallel? Truman goes to Wake Island, meets with Douglas MacArthur, who gives him the worst possible advice. He says to him, yes, of course, cross the parallel. He said, I've seen, first of all, he says, the Chinese will not come in. He said, I've seen their armies fight in World War II. Of course, what he saw were the nationalist armies, not Mao Zedong's communist armies. See, they won't fight. If they come in, they won't be worth a lick. And if they do come in, they'll be the greatest slaughter because they have no air cover. See, dead wrong. Indeed, Mao Zedong comes in. He makes a blunder too. 900,000 of Chinese perish in that fighting. 3 million Koreans on both sides of the line lose their lives in that conflict. And what's the outcome? Did I tell you? Back at the 38th parallel, both sides still poised, still struggling with each other. As recently as last week, the North Koreans are rattling the sword, talking about striking against South Korea if they don't stop their propaganda. What was the point of that war? Now, as I said, I understand that Truman had to go in. But you know, crossing the parallel, again, there was huge pressure on him. Remember what Richard Nixon said about Adlai Stevenson in the 1952 presidential campaign? Stevenson has a PhD from Dean Acheson's Cowardly College of Communist Containment. The point is that this would have been containment, which of course was the strategy that allows us to win the Cold War without a direct conflict. And it would have been, it seems to me, the wise thing to have done. But the political pressures in this country were so enormous on Truman to avoid this idea that it was cowardly containment. It was time, they said, for liberation, for rollback, which of course was Eisenhower's slogan, the Eisenhower-Nixon slogan in the 1952 campaign. But Eisenhower knew better. And indeed, when Eisenhower went to Korea after he was elected, and he flew over the lines between the Chinese and the North Koreans and the South Koreans and the Americans, Syngman Rhee and a number of people in the United States were pressing him to launch an offensive, and he knew his military history, and he knew something about strategy and tactics, and he wouldn't do it. He said, they're too well dug in. The price we would pay would be ferocious. And of course, what he did behind the scenes was to threaten the Chinese with the possible use of atomic bombs. It frightened them into coming back to the peace table, and we got a truce in Korea. Anyway, these are just a handful of the mistakes I see. And all I can tell you is when I teach my students these days, and I still teach, I teach a seminar for Stanford University in Washington. They have a very active program. What I tell my students is, if I depress you too much, you can't sue me for your psychotherapy bills. I appreciate it's a somewhat dark view of human affairs, but, you know, have we achieved Valhalla, Wilson's proposition of a war to end all wars, making the world safe for democracy? I'm afraid we're still a long way from doing it. But if they'll only read my book. Enough said.
Well, I think after that fascinating discussion, everybody will want to read your book. Anyways, I'd like to open the floor to discussion and just ask that you wait till the microphone comes to you and identify yourself. John.
Thank you very much both for today and your work. I'm teaching a course on
Could you
similar
identify
topics.
yourself, please?
John Hirsch.
Thank you.
Up at Columbia. And, you know, the way you presented this morning about miscalculations and misjudgments can be extrapolated through Vietnam and Iraq. So, without going into the whole story of those two wars, but millions of people have died in both of those wars over decades. So now the United States, as we all know, is in Afghanistan. So and there's a big debate in this country and elsewhere about whether what's being done there makes any sense. So I wondered if you could offer some comments on whether there's not a sort of a, there's also, you never know what the other guy's doing. I mean, you sort of infer that without quite saying it. I mean, that's part of this problem is what Joseph Nye calls the prisoner's paradox.
Yes.
But, you know, what suggestions do you have for the conduct of U.S. foreign policy that derive from this analysis? And thinking again about Vietnam and Iraq.
Yes. Thank you for that wonderful question, because, you know, this is something that came up at our dinners with the president. And at the first dinner, Bob Caro, Lyndon Johnson's biographer, was there, and he raised with the president the fact that Lyndon Johnson's Great Society came to a halt as a consequence of Vietnam, that it stopped it in its tracks, so to speak. And I then said to him, Mr. President, I said, you know, there's a rule of thumb I teach in my American history classes, namely that these wars kill big reform movements. World War I killed off progressivism. Franklin Roosevelt said Dr. New Deal's been replaced by Dr. Win the War. Truman's Fair Deal went a glimmering with Korea, and Vietnam, of course, as Caro said, called a halt to the Great Society. He knew what I was saying. He said Iraq was a mistake. Now, there was nothing new there. He had been saying that on the campaign trail. And at the second dinner, when I raised something about this again with him, he said, Iraq was a mistake. I'm getting out now. Gary Wills, the historian, was also at this dinner, the first dinner. And Gary said to him directly, don't get into Afghanistan. It's a trap. It is a bottomless pit. In essence, he was saying, remember what happened to the British and the Russians there. It's a no-win situation. And he said on that occasion, it's the only time in these two dinners that he said, off the record, I'm not mindful of what you're telling me. I've got a problem. Now, anyone who's read Bob Woodward's new book, Obama's Wars, I think what you find there, and I also inferred this, I have an article in the current issue of Foreign Policy about the tyranny of metaphor. And I begin the article by quoting from Dennis Brogan, the British historian who in 1952 published an article titled, in Harper's Magazine, an article titled The Illusion of American Omnipotence. And I said that this just as easily could be called the omnipotence of American illusion, see? And that's what this is. And Will said in a piece in the New York Review of Books, Mr. President risked becoming a one-term president by getting out of Afghanistan. It is a no-win situation. Sacrifice of blood and treasure to no particular good end, you see. Will's then, after the president announced that he was increasing the troop commitment by 30,000 in Afghanistan, Wills publicly broke with him. Sadly, Wills was not invited back to our second dinner. I regret that. I think he should have been there, you see, to voice his opinion again. I raised something about wars again. The president repeated what he said about Iraq. He didn't talk about Afghanistan. Let me tell you what I think is going on with him. My interpretation, my judgment. I think he knows full well what we're talking about. I think he's intensely mindful of that. But you know, what we're operating with here, I believe, is the politics of foreign policy. The same thing that Harry Truman had to struggle with when he had to make that decision about crossing the 38th parallel. During the campaign, after the president said many times he voted against the Iraq war, he had to say Afghanistan was the right war. This was the correct war. You know, it reminded me of Dukakis when he was running against the first Bush. Remember he put on that tank helmet and somebody said he looked like Snoopy? And it was ridicule. He was ridiculed for that. But he was trying to influence the image of himself as someone who knew something about national security. Why haven't we had a woman as president? Egads, it's ridiculous. Why haven't we? In part because this national security preoccupation, you see, that we're so fixated on this idea that you have to have somebody who knows something about the military. Well, what the hell do they know? Look what happened with Vietnam, with Iraq, you see. All this information and this sort of knowledge, you know, I think the president understands this fully, and that's why in his speech he also said, come July 2011, he's going to begin a withdrawal. And I think he's really committed to that. And that's what Woodward raises in that book. I think he talks about his tremendous ambivalence. But the political pressure on him is enormous to appear as... Now, I did an interview yesterday for the book with Charlie Rose, and Charlie said, it was a good question. He said, well, where's his courage? Remember John Kennedy's Profiles in Courage? Although, as Eleanor Roosevelt said during the '60 campaign, when she recalled Kennedy's behavior toward Joe McCarthy and the censure, she said, I wish he showed less profile and more courage. But on the other hand, you know, I understand. There's a good reason why I'm not a politician. I'm a historian. I don't want to have to make those compromises. But, you know, the historian doesn't have to. We can be, you know, principled and heroic, and the point is that this is the reality of American politics, and I think it's where the political culture is in this country, you see. And so a group like yours, I think, does the Lord's work in that you're struggling to hopefully make people more mindful of the limits of this kind of militarism. One of the things I regret is that President Nixon put into place the volunteer military. I think you need a draft. When you're going to go to war and lives are going to be sacrificed, it should not be those handful of people who volunteer. It should be a commitment from the whole society. See, that's, I think, absolutely essential. But what do I know?
Excuse me. Ron Berenbaum. Much of what you said about the aftermath of World War II could be said about the run-up to World War I and the aftermath of that.
Yep.
So, and any number of other catastrophes. So, what do you think are the distinctive lessons of the World War II post-war period? And is it possible to say, I know this is kind of a perverse notion, and I take no exception to anything you've said about how badly things turned out, but didn't they turn out maybe a little bit better than the aftermath of World War I?
Oh, yes.
And that was what these statesmen were trying to avoid,
Yes.
and weren't they modestly
Yep.
successful in doing
Yep.
so?
Yeah, it's a very good point you're making, that there's no question that especially if you want to emphasize the better side of things, the better angels, Truman's containment doctrine was, at the end of the day, very wise, very sensible. We avoided a big nuclear war, and we have avoided one so far. Doesn't guarantee that this will go on forever, but we avoided one. And the lesson they did take from World War I was that you could not do this kind of mamby-pamby peace arrangement. At the end of World War I, all the rhetoric and the Versailles Treaty, Article 231, the Kriegsschuldfrage, who's guilty of causing the war, Germany, Austria-Hungary, punish them, reparations, et cetera. Well, we didn't occupy them. And it really provided fertile ground for the rise of Nazism and fascism in Italy, you see. And communism came out of, I would argue that so much of that century was the offshoot of what happened in World War I. But we did better at the end of World War II in that, yes, you had to occupy Germany and Japan, and there had to be demilitarization. And, of course, the outcome there is that Japan and Germany have turned in that wonderful direction toward a much more benign and democratic society. And, of course, as I said at the start of my talk, my conversation with that French attorney gave me hope, you see. So I don't see it as hopeless, but on the other hand, you're right, conditions, maybe it's human nature. Maybe it's that people love to fight these wars, and that there is, Freud talked about this, the dark side of human nature. I would hope not, but I'm afraid there's not a history here to suggest that we're going to have, peace for the long term. But you're right. I think there was but again, I come back to my point. To be celebratory about the achievements, it's fine. But if there are lessons to be learned, it's less so from the gains we made than from the blunders. And that's what I tried to do in this book. Talk about, although giving a bow in the direction to, because I think Franklin Roosevelt was extraordinarily shrewd. Just take 1 second to say, in that first book I was telling you about with FDR, what I found there was the fact that Roosevelt mirrored the public feeling in the United States. Wendell Willkie's book, One World, it's an extraordinary volume. Go back and read it. Published in 1943. It's this picture of everybody in the Soviet Union is becoming just like the United States. He says he goes and he meets these sturdy, hardy frontiersmen in Russia who remind him of his ancestors in Indiana. Same in China. He talks to Stalin. He says, you're educating your people so well, you're going to educate yourself right out of your job. You see, democracy. And he says Stalin laughed heartily, as well he might have, at this fool who's, telling him about democracy. Well, Roosevelt understood this perfectly. And he mirrors all this. He comes back from Yalta and he says, this conference represents the end of spheres of influence, the end of balanced power diplomacy. Malarkey. He knew he knew. He said to some senators, he said, spheres of influence govern history. This is what controls. And the payoff to me was September 1944, he and Churchill signed an aid memoir about what? The atomic bomb, in which they say we will not give the secret of the bomb to the Soviets, to Stalin. Because he suspects there's going to be something like, hopefully just a Cold War, not a hot war. So there was a really big upside. But, and the world, maybe incrementally, we do make gains. You know, think of this country. I tell my students, especially these days from the South, 60 years ago, people in that region could not imagine a society in which there was equal voting rights for African Americans, a place at the table, opportunity. Could any of them in their wildest imagination have believed that we would have a black president? I marched with Martin Luther King in Alabama. He invited historians to come. I was lucky enough to be one the last day of that march. And I tell you, I was frightened. I'm a physical coward. And I was scared to death because those Alabama National Guardsmen, a colleague of mine and I went up to one of them. It was a hot, steamy day. We asked for a drink of water from their canteen. They wouldn't give it to us. If looks could kill, they would have killed us. They were so, but happily Johnson had federalized that National Guard, and so they were under orders to be restrained. But what a difference. So has there been progress? Yes. And by God, we'll even see a woman as president of the United States. Who? Bite your tongue. As my dear departed mother would have said, bite your tongue. Maybe it'll be this Kathleen O'Donnell. Isn't it a wonderful country? A woman running for senator from Delaware, and her big issue, she's so worried about masturbation. You know, I off the record, I say now, I studied psychoanalysis for 4 years when I taught at UCLA in Los Angeles. I was in training, and I found it, I didn't want to be a clinician, but I wanted the knowledge. I'm a biographer. I wanted the knowledge. And I tell you, I think what we're dealing with this woman is what psychiatrists would call, and if there's any in the audience, please correct me, would call reaction formation. I think this woman is a compulsive masturbator. And now there's my best interpretation of the day. Correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I was going to ask for your comment. There is a psychiatrist in the audience.
Alan Young, in your view, would the Cold War had evolved differently if Franklin Roosevelt had remained alive?
Excellent question. I speak to that at the end of that Roosevelt book. I don't think so, except that I think it would have come about more quickly than it did under Truman. Because Truman was an FDR shadow, and Truman, the public was so convinced that if Roosevelt had been there, he would have worked out some kind of accommodation with Stalin. And I don't think that would have happened. I think Roosevelt could have said to the public, you know how hard I tried to get along with Stalin? It's not working. Now we have to take stronger action. But Truman couldn't do that because, as it was, Henry Wallace and the Progressive Party, which was evolving, developing, were very much on his case. And he had to be careful not to be seen as breaking with Roosevelt's accommodationist dealings with the Soviet Union. So I think we would have had the Cold War, and I think it would have gone more quickly under Roosevelt. He would have had more credibility to argue to the public that we needed to take a stronger stand.
I want to take the question from Nancy. Right. There are people sitting up there.
In the gallery.
In the gallery.
Nancy Kirk, Would you care to compare General Petraeus to General MacArthur?
No. I don't know that Petraeus has his credentials. Clearly, Petraeus is a very intelligent guy. But I come back to my comment about convictions are a greater enemy of the truth than the lie. And, and in some ways, I feel it's unfair to these guys in the military, in the sense that if a president says, fight this war in Iraq, your commander-in-chief says, so what are they going to do? They go and they fight it, and they're going to give their best judgment as to how to conduct the war. Are they going to say to the president, oh, I think we'll lose? Well, of course, the whole impulse, the whole pressure on them is to take a can-do approach to things. And that was very much the case in Vietnam. They kept telling Johnson, and what you found behind the scenes with the Johnson materials is that the more they encouraged him, the more skeptical he became. He was no fool, but he was trapped by his own rhetoric and trapped by his own convictions that Vietnam would have been a disaster to lose it. Look what happened. We lose Vietnam. Do we win the Cold War? Did it really matter? Did we need to be there in the first place? Walt Rostow was a friend of mine, and Walt used to say, well, Vietnam, we gave the other nations in Southeast Asia time to develop. Now, is it a convincing argument? Maybe, maybe not. But I never in public disputed it with him, because one has to feel for the losses that all those families suffered. 57,800, I believe, were killed in that war. The many, many others who were maimed, wounded, suffered. To say to them, pointless, I think is a terrible slap in the face. And so I think Walt's proposition was something that gave them some solace.
Last question,
Ernest Rubinstein. Had John Kennedy lived and remained in office, do you think he would have had the political courage to pull the United States out of Vietnam before the buildup?
Yes. I think it's a wonderful question. I address it at the end of my book. I don't think we ever would have done in Vietnam what Johnson did. Kennedy was very, very skeptical about these military actions. He saw the Navy chiefs during World War II, and he would write letters home about the misjudgments and miscalculations he felt they were making. The Bay of Pigs stung him terribly, and what it taught him was not to take at face value what these advisors were telling him, including his military advisors. He despised Curtis LeMay, and of course, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, he recorded all those ex-com meetings. And we have those conversations in which Kennedy went out of the room and the military were furious at him that he would not commit himself to invading, bombing Cuba, tried diplomacy first, and we're so fortunate that he was there, because we could have ended up, as we know now, in a nuclear exchange with the Soviets. Vietnam, he urged the removal of, directed Bob McNamara to take 1,000 troops out of Vietnam, advisors out of Vietnam by the end of '63. He was profoundly skeptical about being able to win there. I think he would have won re-election in '64. He said to one of his aides, if Barry Goldwater is our opponent, which he probably would have been, Kennedy said, we're going to get to bed much earlier on election night than we did in 1960. See, he was convinced that he would beat him decisively, and he would have. And I think then he would have found a way to, at least, he never would have escalated, I think, the way Johnson did with those troops. He saw it as a trap. He told Arthur Schlesinger that. Arthur had talked to me about that, told me about how skeptical he was. Now, we'll never know exactly what he would have done. And you can write into history anything you want when it's, this sort of counterfactual history. But I think I would like to think he never would have done that. But we did it, And we paid a terrible price for it, and especially the families who lost loved ones. So it is. I hope I can come back in 100 years to see what's happened to the country.
You just told me I like it. I hope history will repeat itself and bring you back here. Thank you very much for a wonderful morning.